just another story of the same. You know, we're having a good time.
Feeling the vibration.
Bring John B down.
Use another words.
I'll be in the front row.
Oh man, with cross colors on and everything.
Welcome to the Baltimore Bureau Podcast Show. Everything is all mixed up today. We are sorry for being a couple of days delayed with this episode. We're recording on a Monday morning instead of a Friday morning. As you know, Mercury is in retrograde, or as we've been saying, Mercury is in Gatorade, so we're a little bit loopy this morning. As always, I'm Dharna and I'm here with my co-hosts Khalilah and Easy.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, y'all.
We have a week of pieces to talk about. Everything from climate change to Afro-Latina Day. Some good stuff.
Yeah. And we have a very bringing the national to the local week this week. Yep. Some weeks we go very hyper local and we talk about things happening in specific neighborhoods or policies happening at a city level. This week we want to mix it up a little bit, and we're bringing you bigger picture national issues, which we're going to make relevant to Baltimore for all of y'all.
Yeah, you'll find the string threaded through each of these is a Baltimore connection, whether it's an organizer or a story that bubbled up from Baltimore that took on a national frame.
That's right.
We're going to get into this first piece. Dharna, you spent some time in the DC area for the Youth Climate March.
I did. It was it was pouring rain for 7 hours, and by the end of the day we were all soaked and shocked that we hadn't ruined any of our equipment. But yeah, we went anyway because these kids are this youth-led climate movement called 0 Hour organized this march in DC with sister marches across the country to demand real action and accountability, frankly, from politicians for their lack of action on climate change. So yeah, let's take a look. The 0 Hour Youth Climate March in Washington, D.C. was organized by young people to demand decisive action on climate change.
I'm 16, I'm under voting age, so I don't get to decide what the politicians back there, who they are and what they do, but I get to pay the biggest consequences for their actions.
Actions were also held in other cities, but organizers traveled to D.C. from all over the country. Speakers included some of the young people who organized the march.
We will not be known for our tall skyscrapers, landing on the moon, or building walls. We will only be known as the cause for the extinction of everything on this planet.
Youth from Standing Rock.
In Standing Rock, where I live, we're still fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline. Every day, it's a crisis. I don't know whether or not that pipeline will break, and when it does, it's 10 minutes away from getting into my school, 15 minutes away from from contaminating my home water system.
And a young DC resident.
I'm here to make sure the adults making the laws think about us too. Malala said, even if I'm a girl, even if people think I can't do it, I should not lose hope. For all the kids out there listening today, we got this.
Almost all scientists agree that climate change is human-caused, and that if we don't reduce fossil fuel emissions drastically in the coming decades, some even say altogether, will usher in catastrophic effects like unprecedented sea level rise and extreme weather.
We will be still alive 50 years from now. Would there be food? I look at how many wars will there be, because when people start fighting for fishing, food, so there's foreshadowing how will the future look like. It'll be like Mad Max.
Protesters say world leaders have failed to take the necessary steps to protect the planet. Their demands include reducing emissions by 10% every decade. The organizers were energized by the Trump administration's climate denial, but the White House is not their target.
Trump is not our target. He's just one guy who everyone focuses on, but he is a lost cause. He's gonna be gone soon, and it's this problem, it was before him and it's gonna come after him.
We could get Trump out of office, but the people in power, like the senators, the representative, are the ones literally in the hands of fossil fuel powers. It would be great to get Trump out of office, but that wouldn't be enough. We actually aren't addressing the problem of like campaign finance.
Earlier this week, key members of Zero Hour held a lobby day in Washington, D.C. They met with just under 40 elected officials and aimed to get as many officials as possible to pledge to not accept money from fossil fuel industries.
We're asking leaders to divest from fossil fuels and promise the young people that they are going to be taking proper action around the climate crisis by not taking money from fossil fuels. So we passed our fossil fuel pledge along, and our leaders are going to be looking at it and hopefully signing it.
Zero Hour was inspired by the Women's March, the Black Lives Matter movement, and the March for Our Lives. Their platform highlights those most severely impacted by climate change, including the Global South, poor people, people of color, indigenous people, and other marginalized groups.
The best way to address climate change is going to address, starting off with who's mostly impacted by fossil fuel industries.
And they say this march is just the beginning.
Because this isn't just the beginning of one march. This is the start of us taking control of our future.
For The Real News, with Jess Lenore and Rouge Sheikh, this is Dharna Noor.
While we live in a dream, shove a backpack to my back, I'm under attack. You say I can't even rap fast, I will never backtrack.
I like the little diplomat.
Yeah, the tiny diplomat.
The tiny diplomat. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to hear more from her. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if you are in Baltimore, you know the past couple weeks we've been experiencing a lot of rain. It's funny, I was standing outside, was it Thursday? And it started hailing. It's like,
wow.
Yeah.
Hailing in July, and it's a dude just standing there next to me, and he jokingly goes, "What climate change?"
Yeah.
And it's just like, it's one of those things where it's really crazy to see how many people don't take this stuff seriously. But I like that the young people are getting in front of it, and they're like, you know, this directly affects me, and what I have going on. So,
yeah, you know. Seems like every bit of revolution is usually sparked by young people.
It's true.
And these young people from Zero Hour are really ratcheting up awareness and demanding that we stop pretending like climate change is not happening, like for the sake of not even them, but for their children and their children's children. So really proud of them. Glad to see that they have some specific asks.
Yeah, their platform is actually really comprehensive and really centers the human impact of climate change. And of course, the fact that, like every issue, the people who are always going to be hit first and worst are, you know, poor people, people of color, people in the Global South. They are relentless about bringing that into every single ask and demand that they have of any policymakers or even just other organizers. So yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing more from them. They say that this march is just the beginning. So yeah, we'll definitely keep following what they're doing. And one of their co-founders is actually from Baltimore. Shout out to Nadia.
Oh wow.
Yep.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what else they do with that. That's love. This next piece we got is a piece that I did this week on the Pennsylvania North Avenue corridor. There's efforts right now to create a black arts and entertainment district in Baltimore. There's been talks about it for years in different forms, but this is the first time that somebody's actually working to put the application in to designate a black arts and entertainment district. So in the piece, we talked to Kevin Brown, who is a business owner and activist in one of the arts and entertainment districts here called Station North, and then Lady Breon, who is pushing the effort to create a new black arts and entertainment district.
She was out at Artscape collecting signatures, right?
Yeah.
She was at Artscape over the weekend collecting signatures, had some volunteers out there. I got a chance to talk to her afterwards because we got a lot of rain over Artscape weekend. I didn't get a chance to catch her then. But afterwards, got a chance to catch up with her and just this is something that I'm going to follow. I got wind of it back a few months ago. I did a piece on the mayor's arts task force that she created following the burning down of the ghost ship in San Francisco or Oakland, and then shutting down the Bell Foundry here. And there was this whole task force created to address art spaces, which led into another conversation about arts and culture in general.
And who has access to it.
And who has access to it, which led to Lady Breon putting in a piece in there that would designate funds, or at least begin the conversation about designating a black arts and entertainment district. So it's interesting to see. I'm going to be on top of it. But yep, here's where we are now with it. Baltimore is often highlighted for being one of America's most violent cities. With the high murder rate and recent revelations of police corruption, the city faces many challenges. But the charm of the city can be found largely through its arts and culture.
The wonderful thing about the city, or maybe the awkward thing about the city, is that there are pockets of poverty and islands of excellence, meaning that there are people doing really, really well in certain parts of the city with their arts and their crafts. And in other parts of the city, they're grappling for resources. We should have some type of seamless success where everybody is doing good and everybody rises at the same time. That's so important.
Even with such a rich history in the arts, Baltimore also faces challenges with who has access to these resources. There are 3 arts and entertainment districts: Station North, Bromo, and Highlandtown.
And what makes Station North Arts District different than the Bromo District or the Highlandtown Arts District is that the artists were already here.
Kevin Brown is co-owner of 2 cafes, the Station North Arts Cafe and Nancy, both located in Station North. Kevin and his partner Bill have been in Station North since 1993.
We've been here in the neighborhood for 25 years this year. As a matter of fact, the first thing we did in Station North was to bring Eartha Kitt here. We were there before any of those white groups were in there. I've seen a number of what I call legacy residents be displaced because of gentrification, because of new ideas, new plans. It's the $27 million North Avenue Rising Grant that Senator Barbara Mikulski put on North Avenue from Hilton to Milton to improve buildings, sidewalks, curb cuts, transportation, beautification, facade improvement. And it's all coming together at one time. But for who?
Lady Breon is an award-winning spoken word artist and slam champion, as well as the cultural curator of Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, a black think tank leading the charge in creating a black arts and entertainment district. The target area is the historic Pennsylvania Avenue corridor. Breon's organization is set to be the fiduciary and managerial body of the Black Arts and Entertainment District should it come into existence. Once home to theaters, bars, and social clubs during the country's most segregated times, Pennsylvania Avenue was once a safe haven for not only black entertainers who made the stop on what was called the Chitlin Circuit, but its patrons who did not have to abide by Jim Crow laws like entering venues from the back door or being serviced in alleyways. Pennsylvania Avenue has since seen the decline that many American inner cities have seen, falling victim to the crack epidemic of the 80s and 90s, white and middle-class flight to the suburbs, and loss of key businesses.
Since earlier this year, February, I've been working to put in the full applications to the Maryland State Arts Council and Department of Commerce to actually get this area designated. And I've received a lot of support and have been working with partners all along the Pennsylvania Avenue corridor, including Pennsylvania Avenue Main Street, Upton CDC, Druid Heights CDC, Arts Social Club, and a number of other organizations.
But this isn't the first time talks of a black arts and entertainment district have taken place in Baltimore.
What's different about this time, this go-round? There's never been a formal application submitted on behalf of the city of Baltimore to designate this area. So this would be the first application that would actually be submitted. So I'm hopeful that this time around we can actually make it happen.
Some people, including Kevin, are skeptical about revitalizing Pennsylvania Avenue.
This is that the time for Pennsylvania Avenue was a long time coming. And I've seen many plans to revision it, to rebrand it, to repackage it. It needs leadership and resources. I don't think it's maybe the greatest place to do it because things have happened there before and we want to recapture that. I get that. But I think for Black Arts District, if you're going to do it, I think you need to start somewhere fresh and build out from that.
But Lady Breon believes there's no better place to do it.
This area has experienced extreme disinvestment, and that's the point. That's the reason, one of the reasons why this is the area that I think is perfect for this effort, because arts and entertainment districts are a signal to the city of Baltimore, to investors, to enterprises and businesses that this is a place that you should come and invest in. And I think it's actually untrue that there is no investment in this area. North Avenue Rising is a large grant that is going to be significantly changing the North Avenue corridor. You also have a number of new pots of money that is coming down the pike from the city of Baltimore and the state of Maryland to invest in areas like Pennsylvania Avenue. This area actually is an intersection of a number of incentive programs, from an opportunity zone to food incentive tax credits. There's a number of folks who have tried to figure out ways to bring in new businesses, to bring in new investment, to inspire new community development. So I think the opposite is true. I think what it has been missing is the concerted effort to use all of those incentives to actually better this area.
I asked Lady Breon what a new Pennsylvania Avenue would look like.
The team that I'm working with, we have envisioned, a list of goals for Pennsylvania Avenue, if you will. And some of those things include, first and foremost, we want to create what we're calling a destination for diasporan cuisine. So if you think about Maryland, if you think about the East Coast, I can't name a place where it's like, if I want Black food, where do I go, right? If I want food from the Caribbean, or I want food from West Africa, I want Senegalese food, or food from Ghana, or Southern cuisine that Black folks do it and do it right, where do I go? And our hope is, with the Avenue Market, and you have Supreme Eatery and other places, that we could really tailor this avenue to be that kind of destination. Another goal that we have is to really create a strategy combining community development and a strategy to bring in new arts enterprises and organizations to utilize a lot of these vacant storefronts that, have been vacant for decades in some regard, and maybe find some capital improvement dollars or bond bills or what have you that can be that, foundational pot of money to bring these buildings up to code and get some new business there. Another goal for us is to actually make Pennsylvania Avenue a destination, a tourism destination, by way of a large-scale annual festival. And so we've been throwing around ideas of what that could really look like. We have a lot of goals, and we recognize that, crime and blight has definitely withered away this community, if you will. And we're hoping that arts and entertainment, coupled with strategic community development, can help answer back those things as well.
Both artists believe investment in and support of the city's arts and culture is vital.
It's an art city, and it's a city that needs some rebranding, and the arts will help us move to the next level.
So what's interesting about this piece is hearing kind of the tension between longtime arts activists, longtime artists in the community, and in the form of Kevin taking a position about whether or not there should be a new location for a Black arts district, or we should revitalize a corridor that is really historically known for being a place where Black artists from across the country were coming when they had nowhere else to go and really be themselves and be free.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things when talking to Kevin was that for him, he's pushed through, having been a business owner in Station North and been there so long, he's pushed through a lot of the barriers that a lot of artists have had to deal with, So at one point off camera, he said to me, he was like, I'm Black and I'm gay, but my business isn't gay. My business isn't Black. You know what I mean? He's like, from his standpoint, we just got to, I think he felt like we need to, get in there and work as hard as we can and make it how we can. And I think he's more skeptical about the longevity of a Black arts and entertainment district in that particular neighborhood, and whether or not it's going to either push the residents that are there out or fail because the people around there can't, don't make enough to support that arts and entertainment district there. And I think Breon's point is, no, this is exactly where we should be doing it. So it's an interesting conversation, I think, taking place. I look forward, and actually in the process of making this piece, I think the two of them might end up sitting down talking to each other.
Good.
Yeah,
that's what we need to do.
Yeah. And I'll be really interested to see how this plays out, because I think that, there's such a rich history there in Penn North that could be revitalized. It's a really interesting part of the piece as you go into the history of, Black art in that district, in that neighborhood. But I think that the fear of people being displaced by raising property values and by bringing in a maybe creative class or whatever are legitimate. So I'd be interested to see what kinds of steps can be taken to make sure that, the wealth that's generated from that actually goes to the people in that part of West Baltimore, and doesn't just end up being sort of co-opted in a way to just bring in more developers or more people who are just going to be exploited.
Because it's a lot of interesting stuff going on. Like, in talking to Breon, I interviewed her right across the street from what used to be the Royal Theater, and there's still kind of a memorial there. There's a guy who owns a bakery on Pennsylvania Avenue called the Avenue Bakery, and he's been leading a whole separate effort to rebuild the Royal Theater. You know what I mean? And so in talking to Breon, I found out that there's his effort that some people support, some people don't. Like, there's all kind of roadblocks and politics into, what happens on this Pennsylvania Avenue corridor, and I think it's going to be really interesting to watch.
Yeah, well, speaking of food, I love the innovation in her idea of bringing global food to that district and to that corridor. I lived in that community for 10 years in the Heritage Crossing development. As a matter of fact, my next door neighbor was, he's still alive, but was James Phillips, who's a renowned artist, professor at Howard University. So my experience in the community was having this amazing artist living next door to me. But, I think the possibility of food and the way food brings people together and being conscious of inviting restaurants willing to embrace a mindset where the food remain affordable for the people already in the community could be really powerful, right? I mean, people don't realize the many different immigrants who live in Baltimore. We just had the Caribbean Festival just 2 weeks before. It was, thousands and thousands of people. And oftentimes people think of immigrants as just Spanish speaking or Hispanic appearing, when we have, I think, a Syrian population here, a large Afro-Caribbean population. We still have a number of people coming in from Eastern European countries as well. So that could be dope. And I don't know of anywhere else where there's a food festival in this country. And that corridor really is conducive to it. Yeah, and
and that community is very rich. I think a lot of people ride by and they see the trash on Pennsylvania Avenue, or they see vacants, or addicts or drug dealers out there, and it automatically kind of scares them away from it. But
they make assumptions.
That community is very much still a community. My daughter just had a birthday party at Shake and Bake on Saturday. And when we went, it was like, that's a place that I grew up going roller skating, you know what I mean? And it felt like I was back home as soon as I walked in,
Yeah, but when you think about
everybody, they took care of us, and it was, it's still very much a community worth investing in.
The other thing that's happening in that community that people don't see, because they may see the vacants and want to make a beeline out of there, are the multiple urban gardens that are inside the community, that community members have taken over vacant lots and develop urban gardens. So that food connection is there, that economic development connection is there. And we're going to talk about a piece a little bit later that Mark Steiner did related to social entrepreneurism. But right now, why don't we get into the next piece? It's a report I did about 2018 Afro-Latina Day. Afro-Latina Day started in, 1992, Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. And this story has a personal interest for me, particularly because my family is Costa Rican, but also the conference that I covered in D.C. Really centered survivors of sexual assault, childhood sexual assault, which I am also a survivor. And it was a very powerful day to hear and be among people who embrace their healing in a way that is intergenerational, where they use artistic expression, and also just, here are all of my identities, you will see them. I'm not going to hide any one of them to make you comfortable. But it was a very powerful piece. I got to meet and interview Mama Ntozake Shange. So this colored girl has not had enough. It was, you know, a little
searching
surreal.
after her own rainbow.
My own rainbow. But let's take a look.
Throughout the Americas, from Alaska to Tierra del Fuego, every single nation state that exists today was established on rape, on genocide, and consistent rape of indigenous and African women. So it's not only something in the United States, it's throughout. I don't know how it happened in other places, but I know the Americas, there is no one corner that had escaped that.
July 25th is the annual observance of International Afro-Latin American, Afro-Caribbean, and Diaspora Women's Day. This year, The Real News joined the second annual U.S.-based conference at Howard University School of Law.
So this isn't just for DC. And I'm thinking of actually developing a template so that sisters could have, and they could take it and they could tweak it, but they can have like the steps of looking at this, because this is about building our leadership. This isn't about me. This is about the leadership of Afro-Latinas who are survivors, who live in DC, who are finding a voice and then finding sisterhood and siblinghood, and wanting to have deep, critical conversations about things we don't talk about. And in fact, we often get shamed about.
Over 1/4 of Latinx people in the United States identify as Afro-Latin. Unknown to many, the celebration of Afro-Latin women began in 1992 in the Dominican Republic, and along with many organizations celebrating Afro-Latinx culture year-round, it has seen a resurgence of interest in the United States.
What I see is Afro-Latino women demanding, taking up space within Latina spaces, whether it's cultural spaces, magazines, but also, articulating a history of whitening and whiteness that dominates in Latin America, that often gets left out of the conversation if we're thinking about U.S. Latinidad. I see this flourishing, right? And now Afro-Latinas are saying, there's no excuse for you not to know that we exist, right? We're here and we're demanding spaces within, I think, both Latino culture, but also within Black and Black American spaces.
Organizers are using the celebration to build community among Black women and non-binary people from across the diaspora, as well as to provide space for healing and growth for survivors of sexual assault.
Much about the work that I do is the practice of, reclaiming my own identity, because, when we're assaulted, we lose our sense of agency. And so the work that I do is a practice in regaining that. And, I think about some of the challenges that I deal with in regards to my own mental, emotional health, and then those survivors that I have relationships with as well. And I try to kind of address those issues in my work and bridge those gaps. And for me, that work is self-care.
The conference also provided an opportunity to build sisterhood and provide education about experiences of Black women descended from enslavement, with a particular focus on learning and affirmation between people of all ages.
So there's so much exciting stuff happening, but the thing I'm most excited about is that I'm here and that we're here together and we're celebrating ourselves and we're honoring ourselves and we're making space for ourselves and we're naming each other. And it feels really beautiful because for Afro-Latinx folks, we don't often have those spaces, particularly for women living at the intersections of race and gender and ethnicity and immigration status and being survivors and being queer. Like, we're bringing all of ourselves to this space, and that feels really amazing and safe.
Our strength and our hopefulness and our resilience and our ability to see past the immediate danger to a safe landing, to safety, and our ability to offer safety to others.
Why do you think it's important for young women in particular to explore the world and see women like them in other communities and in other countries?
It's important because our girls think their world is limited to their block, and the world is limited to English speakers, or it's limited to people who are one color. And that's not true. The world is much bigger than that. And the more we can offer our girls in terms of experiences that are not there, that are not familiar to them, the broader and more capable as adults they'll be.
I'm Dr. Khalilah Harris for the Real News Network. Stay tuned for the second installment of this two-part examination of the experiences of Afro-Latinas, International Afro-Latina Day, and the connections between Black women and girls from across the diaspora.
Man, really, thank you for, first of all, thank you for sharing your experience with us, but thank you also for centering these voices. From that opening quote, you can really tell that this is a conference that's kind of unlike many of the other ones that we cover, which really center, ideas that are removed from people rather than these, like this kind of conference, which actually brings, this healing and sisterhood and everything to conference attendees. Mm-hmm. And also just, for I think a number of us hearing from Ms. Ntozake Shange was a real treat in getting to have that on our platform.
We're going to have her back. She is sharp as a tack. I asked her, she actually shared a piece during the event. I asked her in advance, what piece are you sharing? Will you tell me what it is? She was like, no. I'll see what comes to me when I'm in front of the room. So she was like, have a seat, child. Let me just tell you what I'm gonna tell you. But she's phenomenal. Luz Marquez Bembo, she's amazing, and as you heard, hoping to have this observance really take hold, because it's not just about Afro-Latinas. It's African descendant women across the diaspora, right? The Dominican Republic is heavily the people are heavily African descended.
Yeah.
It is on an island shared by Haiti, which is even more heavily African descended. But there are dynamics on that island that play out here in the United States. Yeah. People really aren't clear that countries like Brazil have half of the population is Black. We had a sister, Monica Carrillo, was there, who talked about experiences of Black women in Peru. She's also Peruvian. So it was dope. But also hearing from Dr. Asia Leeds from Spelman, and this is the first in a two-part piece where I'm going to talk to a group of girls. We talked to them before they left, and we'll talk to them when they return. A group of girls from Baltimore Design School and a couple of other high schools from a mentoring program called Blossoms. Visited the Dominican Republic last week, and want to hear from them about their experiences and what they learned and what it taught them about themselves. So,
the thing I like about the approach, especially around sexual assault, is like these are groups that are over sexualized. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Right. By so many other groups, and
they don't see us, but when they do see us, it's like, hey, mommy.
They see you. Like, they want to take all those qualities, the lips, the shape, and the skin tone and all that, but not really talk about the stories of what happens as a result of that over-sexualization of, women of color.
Mm-hmm. And girls.
Yeah, girls of color at that, yeah.
We'll look forward to hearing again from you and hearing from these girls who actually got to go to the DR and see that firsthand. Yeah. And our final piece today is one that I think we've been sort of splicing through our conversations about what happens when a business tries to fight capitalism in some sense, whether that's even possible, how sort of activist entrepreneurs brought some of these ideas like Black power and feminism and environmentalism to the marketplace, and what some of the positive ramifications of that are, but then also how some of those ideas were then co-opted. So this is an interview with Joshua Clark Davis, the author of From Head Shops to Whole Foods, on the Mark Steiner Show. It's a really illuminating and interesting history.
Yeah, let's check it out.
Welcome, everybody, to the Mark Steiner Show right here on the Real News Network. Good to have you with us once again. Today, we're going to take a sojourn back into the past that leads us to the future, from the 60s to now, about examining how the different businesses that were created in the 60s, the co-op businesses, the head shops, the natural food stores, the bookstores, how the feminist movement, all the rest kind of fed into a very special movement that came out of a counterculture movement and countering the main institutions in America. How did they affect the 21st century? How do they affect us now, where we live? We're going to explore that with our guest, Dr. Joshua Clark Davis, who's written this book, From Head Shops to Whole Foods, The Rise and Fall of Activist Entrepreneurs. And yes, once again, if you buy the book, it will not have these tabs, but if you make a contribution to Real News, I might send you my copy. But right now, welcome, Josh. Good to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
So let's begin. This is really fascinating. So I'm curious, let's just start with the beginning. What got you into wanting to talk about the counter institutions that were created in the 60s? I mean, what drew you to that particular subject?
Mm-hmm. You know, I think the big thing was that I wanted to understand how the social movements of the 60s had a broader impact and a broader reach deep into the 70s. And originally I thought that might just be through through consumer culture generally. But what occurred to me after some research was that it was really through businesses that social movements had one of their most unexpected but farthest reaching consequences, I think, and that business really became a surprising vehicle for organizing and for community activity and for political work, one that most historians and just most Americans in general and people worldwide hadn't really considered fully.
Because, I mean, they played a significant role, but I don't think most people have not explored what that role is. I mean, everything that you write about, from the head shops of the 60s when marijuana was illegal, people were selling paraphernalia, to the bookstores, to the food co-ops, to the natural food movement that took place, tied to the environmental movement, especially the black bookstores that were created all across America in the 60s that lent to the revolutionary fervor of the moment. So where do you think the root of that was? You explore that at the beginning of your book a bit, but because where do you think the root of why these counter institutions developed that really were businesses?
Right, so there's two layers to it. I think first of all, a lot of baby boomers who grew up in the 50s and 60s came to realize how discriminatory and how unequal the country's consumer culture was. Criticisms of capitalism obviously were nothing new and go back all the way back to Marxism, to Marx himself, if not earlier. But I think what happened in particular in the post-war era is that some of these activists who came of age,
post-World War II we're talking about.
Right, post-World War II, many of your contemporaries in the 60s saw that it wasn't only through labor that alienation affected people, but that Americans were part of a very unequal, very alienating, and very, in their words, spiritually and morally bankrupt system. By participating in the marketplace, they brought that together with their desire to find new organizing vehicles by the end of the 60s. And I think it's the combination of those two impulses that really gave rise to this tremendous flowering of activist businesses. These weren't new to the 60s. Communists had had bookstores, suffragists had had businesses, socialists had had co-ops going back many, many decades. The abolition movement had businesses, but I think it's in the 60s and 70s, as the economy's booming, that, or at least in the 60s, that these activists took it to a new degree of activist enterprise that was something new to social movements.
So before we jump into these different levels of businesses that were created, I mean, the very idea that you had this radical movement in the 60s that was born out of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and other civil rights movements in the South. Then came SDS, the Students for a Democratic Society, both of whom were based on participatory democracy, had very little trust in these corporate institutions and government institutions as a whole. But one of the things that came out of them is what you wrote about, which were literally businesses which are part of the capitalist world. So talk about that beginning and what those connections were and what you discovered.
So SDS is particularly interesting. People remember their Port Huron statement as an expression of discontent with major political parties, with labor unions, with the growing distance between an American citizen and the larger state that he and she were a part of. And so what's happened, though, is that one thing that was forgotten is that there was an economic critique to the Port Huron Statement. There was a critique of the remote control economy and the idea that not only were political parties becoming less democratic, no longer was a society becoming less democratic, but business and economic activity was becoming less democratic. These activist businesses were part of a large effort to address that. So it stemmed out of these ideas from SDS. And I think, yeah, one of the most interesting things is how not only critics of capitalism, but even anti-capitalists found ways, little niches, little nooks and crannies, I think, in the larger economy to create businesses that were not all that capitalist, that were not focused on accumulating capital, but were focused on democratic empowerment of an economic nature.
And part of this, though, was while it was political, some of the people involved in creating these were not necessarily political activists. I mean, let's say take the kind of the countercultural institutions that came out around natural foods and head shops, which was really different from folks who were, for the most part, who were deeply involved in the civil rights movement or doing demonstrations against the war and organizing draft resistance, but connected but separate, right? So talk a bit about that, because this is, the head shops and the natural food stores were a huge part of this, and probably the greatest successes inside of it in terms of businesses.
Yeah, so it's interesting because I tried to develop a pretty broad framework for thinking about activist business. On the one hand, yes, they're the very traditional grassroots organizers, second wave feminists, black nationalists who are starting businesses that in many ways are not all that different from communist bookstores. They are vehicles for trying to get ideas out and recruit people. On the other hand, in the counterculture, many of the hippies, as you said, didn't come from an activist background. And some people thought of them as unpolitical, but there were a number of hippies, I think, for example, the Yippies who were coming out of New York, who not only were looking at drugs as a form of liberation, but also bringing in the anti-war movement. And so the early head shops, for example, were really meeting places for the anti-war movement.
And head shops, for folks who don't know, are?
Today you call them smoke shops. Kids call them vape shops. It's basically a place where people went for all their rolling papers and their pipes and all the other stuff that you need for smoking all the things that people smoke. And black light bulbs and other stuff. But the counterculture, in a way, was less committed to these social movements, as you said. And what happened was, I think, is that the counterculture clearly became hugely appealing for major corporations. And so it's in this head shop business and in the natural foods business that a lot of entrepreneurs who maybe aren't all that political started streaming in, especially in the early and mid 70s. So it's very different from the businesses you mentioned at the beginning.
There were connections, though, as you write about in here, around the natural foods movement, the movement that was really popular in the late 60s and 70s, with some early 70s, around macrobiotic eating. You talk about Paul Hawkins, who's still a major figure in the environmental movement in this country, and also an entrepreneur who made a lot of money at this. That they created this world of buying healthy organic food before it became commercially popular as it is now, right?
That's right. And I mean, today we totally take it for granted that a conventional supermarket is going to sell tofu, it's going to sell some organic produce, it's going to sell all kinds of things that vegetarians eat, and that
people
wasn't
just health conscious eat.
Right. And that wasn't always the case. And I think it's really something that's been forgotten is how political natural foods were in the 60s and early 70s. The community was tied to the anti-war movement, it was tied to the environmental movement, and really a lot of people were looking at natural foods, health foods, as a way to totally restructure American society. And the thing it connected also to was the cooperative impulse. Not all of the businesses I looked at were co-ops, but a lot of them were, and especially in the natural foods community at first, the idea was this is not only a healthy way of eating, It's a way that we can restructure and really democratize the way people do business.
It reminds me of an interview we did earlier. This issue came up, and I thought about this when I was thinking about having a conversation today about your book, which is we don't always make the connections between what the root of a particular institution or politics or business are in today's world with where it began. So the radical movements may push something and you may not feel it or see it in a larger societal sense for 20 or 30 years. In some ways, what you're talking about in terms of the counter institutions and small businesses started, whether they were head shops or bookstores, or the feminist movement, the black movement, which we'll talk about in a moment, but they were the root of what we see today. There may not have been a Whole Foods if there had not been, you know, for all the rich people to buy their food, been a Whole Foods had there not been for the beginning of these movements and counter businesses that took place in the late 60s and early 70s.
Exactly. So Whole Foods Market is a company that comes out of Austin, Texas in the late 70s. It grows out of the hippie movement. The two founders meet in a vegetarian co-op house in Austin. But by the early 80s, the business had very much moved away from its environmental and I think countercultural roots, and really most significantly moved away from having any critical eye towards capitalism. Originally, Whole Foods Market was doing things like profit sharing, but what happened is the company decided it really wanted to expand and turn into a national powerhouse. There had never been a national supermarket chain focused on health food. And so exactly in the way you described, the radicals of the 60s and early 70s created something that the not so radical, even arguably conservative entrepreneurs like John Mackey of Whole Foods took and turned into something very, very different by the mid-80s.
Right. I mean, the difference is that when we started something here in Baltimore, the Waverly People's Food Cooperative, back in the early 70s. It was a natural grocery store, but people could actually afford to buy the food inside of it because it was a co-op, as opposed to Whole Foods, as people talk about whole paycheck, when you go in to buy whatever you have to buy. So it leads to another question before I come back to some of the nuances of your book around, especially about black liberation bookstores and feminist stores, is that there's this connection. These movements in some ways started as anti-capitalist movements. But when you start a small business, it's part of the capitalist structure, even if you don't want it to be part of the capitalist structure. And part of the natural outgrowth of that is having it itself be consumed by larger entities like Whole Foods or whoever else we might be talking about, right? So there's all these contradictions inside of it that are part of the beauty that went into creating it in the first place.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the central complication in all of this was you had a lot of politically motivated, left-leaning people who, most of whom didn't come from a business background. They then got into starting businesses that, yes, had to exist within a larger capitalist framework. I think most of these activists were not of the mindset that capitalism could be destroyed, but instead wanted to create institutions that were at least somewhat democratic within the capitalist marketplace, and that they really saw how cooperative ownership and democratic management could create a totally different kind of business, and to move away from the idea that a business has to be intent on maximizing profits, has to be intent on a vertical management structure, and has to be really growing in a way that disconnects it from the communities that it's rooted in.
So how do you think, what's your supposition about how those counter institutions, those businesses that were started in the 60s and 70s as co-ops by radical young people, by people in the counterculture movement, black liberation movement, how did they affect who we are in the 21st century?
Right, so there's a dual legacy that the activist businesses had. On the one hand, their ideas have totally been stolen by major corporations, Silicon Valley, the talk about horizontal hierarchies, about mindful meditation, so much of the language that Silicon Valley speaks. It's really the idea of business as a tool for equality. Silicon Valley has totally stolen that language. I think Whole Foods Market in many ways took some of these ideas, the language of liberation through business, and used it to their own financial purposes. On the other hand, especially in the last decade, there has been a resurgence of co-ops. There has been, there's very exciting things going on, like Cooperation Jackson. There are
Jackson, Mississippi, we're talking about.
That's right, and the movement, the Malcolm X grassroots movement that grew out of especially Chokwe Lumumba's mayoral time and his son's administration. But I think what's happened is there's been a resurgence in activism that is focused on trying to create these democratic institutions that happen to be businesses. So there's a debt there, and there's also a debt to a lot of the social enterprises of today, some of which are not very politically motivated and are not very focused on justice and equality. Other social enterprises which actually are focused on community empowerment. So it's a contradictory legacy, and a lot of different groups have taken the ideas of activist businesses and used them in different ways.
So let me come back to the heart of the book again for a moment and then wind our way back to this complex legacy and what it means for now and the future. You spend a lot of time in the book in a couple of chapters talking about the Black liberation movement and the feminist movement and publications and books created. One of those major publications actually came out of where we're broadcasting from, Women's Liberation, that was started right here in Baltimore, became one of the stellar feminist journals in the country for many years. But the feminist movement and the Black liberation movement, the bookstores they created, they didn't survive, most of them, but they had a very powerful effect on the communities they were in at the moment. So talk a bit about that. And we have at least 2 whole chapters in here just focusing on that, like Drum and Spear in DC and other Black bookstores.
So Black power bookstores, and I would say also the full range of feminist businesses, which included not only bookstores, but printing presses, feminist credit unions at a time when
women,
about
that in here, right?
Yeah, when women were widely discriminated against by banks. These things are bubbling up, and as you pointed out, a lot of them, most of them don't even exist anymore. But if you look at feminist printing presses, for example, the book Our Bodies, Ourselves, that came out of the Boston Women's Health Collective.
It was
really,
huge.
Yeah.
I mean, huge, massive.
I don't know how many printings there's been. I think it's been over 20, but it's sold millions. It's one of the most important health books, I think, really, of the last 40 years in the United States.
Oh, no, this is a little bit of a digression, but it's absolutely true. I mean, I still have the very first volume of that, and it had an effect on multiple generations of women in terms of gaining control over their own health and health needs and how they wanted to see health done for women. That was the heart of building a revolution in this country for women in terms of women's medicine and health that didn't exist beforehand. So that these institutions actually did have an effect.
The women's health movement was huge, and the women's health clinics that were popping up in the 70s, some of which continue until today, were very closely tied to these other women's businesses, right? Some people might call an institution a business, others might call it an enterprise, another might call it an organizing tool, but they were very closely connected to each other. If you look at Black power bookstores that were coming out of the Black nationalist movement, major booksellers didn't really sell books by African-American authors before the 1970s, except with a few big exceptions. They sold works by James Baldwin or by Ralph Ellison, but most Black authors couldn't make their way into the white-dominated literary marketplace. So places like Drum and Spear
in DC, Washington, DC.
Yeah, and the National Memorial African Bookshop in Harlem. There's bookshops all over the country who take a Black nationalist approach to selling books, and they really help make books like the autobiography of Malcolm X a bestseller. They really pave the way for publishers to finally pay attention to Black authors in a way that they hadn't before the late 70s. So a book like Alex Haley's Roots really, in many ways, became a bestseller because publishers were finally admitting that African Americans buy books and were finally investing in it. And Black bookstores continue to grow through the 80s and 90s, but what happened in the 90s is the major publishers started selling more and more books by Black authors, and the major bookstores, the Barnes and Nobles, started adding African American sections, And now a company like Amazon sells, you know, any number of books by Black authors. But really, the mainstreaming, the hard work of making that possible was done by Black Power bookstores decades earlier.
So let's go now to kind of talk about where this book takes us and where your theories take us in all this and what you discovered. I mean, the effect that these counter businesses had on the 21st century and where you think they may be taking us now. There is a movement that's beginning here in terms of doing workers' co-ops in this country that is much larger than people realize and is beginning to take off. There are other groups all over the country, like exist here in Baltimore, Maryland, with the Red Emmas and cooperative-owned businesses like that that sell books and food and more. So so the effect these things have. Did they affect capitalism? Did they affect the way our society functions over the last 40 years? Where do you think they take us? What are you seeing that as the result of all of this?
So these businesses clearly didn't end capitalism, but I
Really?
think, yeah. I almost didn't have to say that. I just wanted to make sure in case anyone was wondering about that question. What these businesses did, I think, when they worked, was they gave their employees and their owners and oftentimes community members a sense of power. And it might be a modest sense of power, but I think it's interesting to think about the moment in which Nixon was in the presidency of the late 60s and early 70s.
Right.
And in many ways how it's similar to our moment today, in which the national political landscape seems so bleak. And I think it's incredibly important for people who are working in communities all over the country to find ways in which they can exert power, real power, and to exert ways that they can change and shape communities, ways that are palpable and tangible. And I think what these businesses often did was they got the ideas of their movements outside of their movements, and they injected them into communities, into the mainstream. Bookstores exposed community members to ideas they'd never even thought about, authors they'd never thought about, ideologies they'd never heard of. And I think also these businesses, especially cooperative businesses, really functioned as community projects in the way that people who devoted their lives to them saw the ways in which these businesses could reach people. And I think in modest ways, they allowed people to have careers that were invested in democracy, that did work towards social justice, careers that they couldn't have had in the mainstream economy. I think that's what worker-owned co-ops offer a lot of people today now, is a modest sense of participation and execution of a project that can impact a community.
So I'm curious, as a person, a professor, who did not grow up in the period you're studying, because you're a historian, and this is now history, which makes me feel like I should be hobbled off the set, but it's history. So as you were unearthing all this, for you, for the first time, I mean, what did it do to you? How did it affect you and your thinking, kind of unearthing? You really came up with some really interesting pieces here, from posters to books and articles and stories about all these counter businesses that were created in the 60s and 70s. So what about you? What did it do to you? How did it change your perspective on all this?
So I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, and I think as a teenager in the 1990s, some of these businesses were still barely hanging on. And they didn't quite make sense to me. You saw a head shop here, or maybe a feminist bookstore there, a Black nationalist business in another place. And I think in a very subtle way, even at that point, I was wondering, where did these businesses come from? They just seem like total anomalies. And I think fast forwarding many years later, what this research for me really revealed is that these businesses that operate on the margins of our economy had these roots in social movements going back to the 60s. And that I think in addition is that their owners often hung on for decades just out of almost pure stubbornness. Right? I mean, what you're really seeing in my book, I think, is a lot of human stories that are almost too hard to believe. The Bloodroot vegetarian feminist bookstore that's still operating in Bridgeport, Connecticut, 40-some years later. Marcus Books in Oakland, founded in the 1960s, just as the Black Power movement is taking off, still run by the same family today. And to really see what individuals who commit their lives to a project can do. And I think, to me, that was one of the most impressive things about this book, is to see how these projects fit into people's lives and how these projects and businesses change them.
So we'd be really remiss if we didn't kind of tackle one piece of this book that I think people are not aware of, but it fits into the entire milieu of the 60s and what the repression that happened from the federal government, from the FBI, trying to annihilate the movement, literally and figuratively, in this country. And the people you write about in this book, the counter-institutions, the black bookstores, the feminist bookstores, were no exception. That the government tried to shut them down and destroy this as it was beginning.
Mm-hmm. You know, the thing about these activist businesses, they were some of the most visible institutions involved with movements in most communities. I mean, activists literally laying a stake in the ground. And I think that law enforcement, both federal and local, and a number of communities saw black-owned bookstores as very, very threatening. They saw head shops as nothing more than just places where they thought people were dealing drugs. And so through my research, I uncovered a number of instances where the FBI was doing surveillance on
Give us a couple that really stand out for you.
Right. So in D.C., Drum and Spear, they were a very convenient target for the FBI, and their FBI file is hundreds of pages long. But all over the country, as part of the larger COINTELPRO effort, black bookstores, to someone like Hoover, and he issued a memo specifically telling all agents in the United States to look into any what he called African-type bookstores. And so that was, you know, a small but very concrete part of COINTELPRO. And basically they saw these bookstores as totally indistinguishable from, say, a Black Panther Party headquarters.
I just think it's a great book. And let me just say to our listeners, to our viewers, that, you know, when I bring somebody on the show here, it's because I like the book, not just because we have to interview this person about the book. Joshua Clark Davis, he is a really good writer, professor of history at the University of Baltimore. From head shops to Whole Foods, the rise and fall of activist entrepreneurs is really well worth the read. There's a lot to wrestle with here, much more than we can get into in a half an hour. I hope we've piqued your interest and you'll check this out. This is really something, as we need to look at our history to really understand where we're going, where the struggle of tomorrow is rooted in our past. Even a past as recent as the 1960s with this book, From Head Shops to Whole Foods. And Joshua Clark Davis, great to have you in the studio. Thank you so much. It's good to have you here.
Thanks, Mark.
This is good. And thank you all for joining us today. I'm Mark Steiner for the Real News Network, right here on The Mark Steiner Show. Catch you all next week.
People talk about capitalism and don't really understand the ramifications of how it can turn good things bad. And, you know, oftentimes we talk about entrepreneurship. We think about the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers who were using self-determination, right? And like a really deep form of economic empowerment, and how some of those ideas got morphed into things that kind of erase the purpose behind it.
Yeah, 100%. And it's, I think, always an important time to be having this conversation. You know, like even just hearing about the possibility of a Black Arts District in Penn North, I think it's really interesting to sort of learn from this history of activist entrepreneurism and learn where the missteps were, learn, you know, how something like Whole Foods, which began as really a co-op, a natural co-op that was trying to build, you know, community empowerment, turned into this massive corporation that won't even pay workers a living wage or have, you know, fair conditions for farmers.
And they're pretty disgusting too. I was all about Whole Foods until we had the Freddie Gray incident here, and I found out that, you know, during the uprising, some of the schools were closed.
Yeah.
And a parent had told me, she said she found out that Whole Foods was feeding the police and the National Guardsmen. So she called to say, look, you know, children are out of school. Do you have anything for children in the community? And she was told by somebody at Whole Foods to contact her local church or food pantry. I'm sure they have something for you. And I was just like, wow, how did that happen? Like that, you know, I mean, if you think about the original concept of it, you never would think that that's where they would go with it. But I mean, they're only in neighborhoods of white affluence. You know what I mean? You're not going to find a Whole Foods in a Black or Latino neighborhood of low income. You know what I'm saying?
Or
it's
even
like,
a poor white neighborhood.
or even a poor white neighborhood. Yeah, you're not going to find them where money is not. So it's like who is really benefiting from all of this stuff?
Yeah, and Josh is something I really like about this interview is that he doesn't over romanticize his history in any way. He's very honest about. Yeah, from the beginning, some of these models were really limited. You know, often these businesses that ended up being hubs of political engagement and of like this sort of thinking about what liberation could mean didn't really begin as any sort of political project. You know, they sometimes were just begun by people who like getting together, wearing weird clothes together and smoking weed together. So that, I mean, just like beginning, I think, from a place where you can be really sure in your principles, I think can go a long way. And I think we can.
I mean, that's the good thing about history, right? You know, being able to take the good pieces from many of those things that have happened as opposed to replicating some of the mistakes.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, particularly in this era, we began talking about young people really taking the reins and making decisions to be political and make change in the world around them, but they don't have to make the same mistakes. So I think the good piece about, you know, tying them all together, even with the Afro-Latina Day piece, is we really need to have intergenerational conversations, because something can be youth-led, but you don't just drop youth out there to do it on their own and make mistakes under the guise of, well, it's youth-led. It's like youth-led doesn't mean the adults advocate responsibility for fertilizing the good things that are coming from them so 100%. That they're good. And so, you know, I really appreciated this piece as well. Yeah, I learned a bunch of things.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, and thanks, Josh.
Yeah. As always, thank you for joining us on the Baltimore Bureau podcast. Shout out to Stephen Frank, Dwayne Gladden, and who else?
David Hebden.
David Hebden, who make this all possible. Our producers, sound guys, and all that. If you are enjoying what you see, please give us money.
Yeah, this is the last week of our fundraising campaign.
Yep, last week of our fundraising campaign. So if you haven't already, please find it in your heart to donate. If you've already given, thank you. We're going to leave out with, we always leave out with some local music. So if you know any local artists,
hit us up.
Hit us up, send us your links. We always want to play some good Baltimore music. This one is from my good friend Hype Keach from the Cold Rhymes label. We just did a dope show this weekend on Saturday. This is called Computer Rocker.
We love you, Baltimore.
Mercury's in retrograde.
Mercury's in Gatorade.
I got the midnighter song in my spirit. I got the man boy Dukes on the brain. But we don't worship a six-string slinger. This computer's gonna save my pain. Computer rocker. Computer rocker. I've learned the ropes from the wild boys running. We let the silence sharpen the blade. I took the plunge into reckless abandon. Go for the crest of the things I made. Computer rocker. Computer rocker. Every night there's a transformation. We know ghosts from the ancient past. Hard drives full of information. Blood rushes to our faces fast. The power of all that is lies waiting for every face and for every age. I feel free as the first man walking, free as a bird to fly